In this episode, I visit with Dave Crozier from Certa on orchestrating workflow to ensure that everything lies within the
Today I
data.
have Dave Crozier. Dave, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Yeah, Tom, thanks for having us.
So, Dave, could you tell us a little bit about your professional background and your current role?
Absolutely. Professional background, I actually started out in aerospace in strategic sourcing, after which I moved on and went from practitioner to solution consultant. So I moved over to Dun& Bradstreet, where I spent 14 years as a third-party risk and compliance solution consultant, dealing with large enterprise, mostly banks, financial institutions, insurance companies, and then large strategic manufacturers. After my stint at D&B, moved over to Certa, got to know Certa from actually working with Dun& Bradstreet as a service or a solution delivery mechanism. And now I lead our digital transformation services group, working with large enterprise customers to transform their operations as it relates to their supply chain and compliance operations within Certa.
So let's move to Certa. I've had the opportunity to visit with you guys before, but could you remind our listeners what Certa does, products and services?
Absolutely. So Certa at our core, we are a workflow automation platform. So we orchestrate enterprise workflows. What that effectively means is we take people, data, process, systems, and tools and connect them all in one place such that organizations can bring everybody together and eliminate the swivel chair that exists right now within most organizations to be able to get the content needed to be able to do the appropriate risk-based due diligence that they need to do without having to go from system to system, tool to tool, place to place. And what we do is we shine a light on process blind spots that most organizations have within their processes. We're data agnostic, we're system agnostic, we're process agnostic. We can orchestrate basically anything. That's the concept behind the organization.
So you used a term I have never heard, which was the swivel chair. Is that the equivalent of siloed data?
It's siloed data and siloed sources. When you think about the compliance process, name your acronym. Most organizations have third party provided content, they've got internal content. They go to external content like databases, registries, just given trusted sources. And they compile all of that data in their own systems by going and capturing that data, swivel chairing to their internal tools, transcribing data, going back outside to get more data, going to other team members. And so they're bouncing around from place to place, typically, in my experience, both as practitioner and as consultant working with these large enterprises to be able to do what they need to do. And there's a lot of cumbersome activities that are built within it. I think we can all agree that for most organizations as cost centers, the systems and tool stacks that these individuals use, they're purpose built. They're purpose to do perform a function, say an ERP system as an example, but not the most friendly to use. So to be able to capture content and serve it fit for purpose wise to the user, a critical aspect from our perspective.
So the capturing of data is certainly one component. How can we move from the simple capturing to either allowing or fostering analysis or through machine learning, AI, or other strategies, move to a more preventative slash predictive mode?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a lot of technological advancements that are going down the route of preparing information such that it's ready for digestion. And when you think of an ability to consolidate content, there's a number of different solutions out there or concepts, right? AI is playing a big role, right, in terms of summarizing content. It's not quite there yet. It's a good start, but obviously you need to do your fact checking. But I think at this point, the best thing that organizations really need to do and have to do is find trusted sources, which means find content, but validate that content is accurate, validate where that information is applicable, because not all sources are created equal. You've got a lot of data aggregators that don't own their data, they're collecting it and taking it for face value. But I think it's up to organizations to determine what is the best source by region, by type, by industry, et cetera, to make sure that they're not just blindly trusting data that they're ingesting. So I think to that end, there's a lot of validation capabilities that exist in the marketplace, whether it be tax ID validation, registry data validation, IDV type capabilities to check the digital identity of an individual, facial recognition tools, AI-based fraud detection tools. So all of these services, when compiled together, really help not just collect the data to get access to it, but they validate the authenticity or the breadcrumb trail on where the data came from. And once compiled and you trust it, then you can determine from a rules-based perspective when to apply it. Just coming from the data industry, having spent many years in that industry, I can tell you that from my own personal experience and our clients' experiences, that not all data coming from all places is created equal. So it's really important to know, while we trust and know your customer, we also need to trust and know your data as well.
David, let me pick up on that because, and I'll just take your prior employer. Typically, if I'm Tom Fox Energy Company, I might hire your prior employer as an external resource to help me vet a potential third-party sales agent, a potential supply chain partner, potential joint venture, or other business partner. You would perform a level that we agreed upon of due diligence, let's call it that. And then you might come up with a report and turn that over to me. And then I would make a decision, perhaps in consultation with you or others, on whether it was appropriate to move forward. How does Certa help move that process internally to Tom Fox Energy or one of your existing customers?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So obviously there's a myriad of different commercial content providers that do a great job of aggregating information. They've got quality control procedures to be able to determine what looks like good information. You can't obviously validate everything, but you need to have your own methodology. But where it really comes in is we look at data from a multitude of different lenses. From my perspective, just quote regulators, you can't rely exclusively on self-disclosed data from a third party. You need to validate it and you need to have validation sources. That's where these commercial databases come into play. And so from our lens, what we always suggest is trust but verify, collect information directly from the third party, complement it and contrast that with what trusted sources have. And then where there's exceptions, either go through automated or orchestrated attestation processes where you're basically covering your bases direct to the third party, but you've also got an investigative capability that you could orchestrate on the fly. So investigate directly with the data provider, have an authentication process directly with the third party. And then also on top of that, in the process of verification, you're typically going to contrast information provided from both sources again, validations. So think of validating the tax ID that's valid and authentic in the eyes of the registry directly. Think of doing IDV to make sure that the person is who they say they are. People are getting very good and fraudsters are getting very good at misrepresenting who they are. So having different techniques that could be deployed along the way that don't add friction to the process, but what they do is that, again, it's a breadcrumb trail of authentications that happen for all of these data sources along the way to make sure that you're going in the right direction. And where there's an exception, what we can do organizationally is bump out to basically trigger this pattern. Looks like there's been some issues with it. You might want to take a deeper dive, but for the others, to again expedite and make the process more efficient, straight through decision automation through a series of checks and balances that are systematic, such that the users can focus on when I've got good data, process it and analyze it. But when I don't, obviously just go through my challenge process to make sure that I can trust the data before I make decisions on something that might not be fit for purpose at that point.
Is the data that's being analyzed done on a, I don't want to say an ongoing basis, but something more than an annual basis? Or is there sort of continuous monitoring to see if something pops up?
Yeah, when you think about compliance controls from my lens or from our lens, data changes. The velocity of data is not slowing down. And so from our perspective, you collect it today, day 2, it could change, day 3, it could change, 60 days, et cetera, it could change. And so to collect it once is great. Most organizations have a periodic refresh on due diligence, which is, again, more stemming from a regulatory obligation or just from an internal set of risk controls. But in between those periods, to have exception-based triggers that say this key set of data, if something changes, notify me. And based on a collective analysis of that data, to be able to automatically trigger the appropriate cure process to make sure that when the data exhibits some sort of pattern or exhibits some sort of risk, you are engaging your controls. Think of payment controls. I onboard company today, everything is good to go. 60 days later, new Russian sanctions regime drops. That entity now has some exposure. highlight it to me that there's an issue, but that's not enough. You need to have circular payment controls. You need to make sure that your systems and your organization isn't caught paying a third party, as an example, that's on a sanctions list because you took time between the notification and the actual distillation or the analysis of that data to make a decision and then to go ahead and go through your manual process to exhibit a payment control. These things should be automated and they have to be automated to make sure that we're all complying with regulations, but also doing our own efforts to make sure that from a global perspective, we're respecting what our shareholders expect from us, what our customers expect from us, and what we expect from us ourselves as organizations.
Dave, perhaps starting with the pandemic, in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now with the competition or coming conflict with China, I think many more people are focused on supply chains than they had been in the past. Do the same strategies you've just discussed for third parties on the perhaps sales or payment side also work in the supply chain side, or is that something, a different approach that you and your team at Certa advocate?
Great question, actually. From our lens, and I think from an industry best practice lens, there's something to be learned from all the time and effort that's come from the additional controls that happen from the financial crisis and the additional scrutiny that's being placed on relationships, both in terms of your sell side and buy side. And so when you think about the buy side and we're looking at our third party relationships, they're critical to the ability to sustain your operations. If you have critical suppliers go under or you can no longer use them and you're single sourced, as an example, it's critical to assess the risk of those third parties. And now every organization under the spotlight of media and social and whatnot also needs to make sure that those associations are clean and intact. And so those same thoughts, risk-based approach processing to your relationships, in my mind, and those that we service from a best practice perspective are critical. And so we're starting to see that learning transmit from the KYC, AML, ABAC side over to the supply chain side to make sure that some of those same controls and best practices, same data sources, same learnings are applied on the supply chain side. So from our lens, it's without question critical because we've seen some customers, as an example, if a single supplier on a single production line goes down for one day, that could be upwards of $1 million of downtime. And again, just the brand impact, the relationship impact, the supply chain impact, the trickle down effect is enormous. And I think we did start to see that through the pandemic. And so I think a lot more organizations are really thinking long and hard as to whether or not their controls are sufficient and they're wanting to come up to what industry would describe as the most cutting edge or the most advanced programs possible, blending cost versus reward, obviously.
So the Certa offering, Certa Accelerate, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So from a Certa perspective, what we're looking to get into the industry is a program by which we can get clients off to fast starts. And so what we're really focused on is out of the gates deployments of modules of best in class widgets that clients could derive and start to get value from day one. And the idea is that instead of having to have a custom ground up program and really taking a large federated approach within an organization to capture what is required, let's start with what we know good to look like, accelerate a program, and then have the ability to modify and customize to the nuances of an organization to make sure that it's fit for purpose. We've seen too many situations where our clients in general, past life, current life, are trying to conform to the constraints of a solution without having the solution constraint conform to their requirements. So there really needs to be a natural blend, in my opinion, of start out with what good looks like, but know that good for every organization will be different based on your construct and your resources. So having the ability to tailor so that it's fit for purpose for you as an organization, but without straying too far, deviating too far from what the average organization is doing, because what you get into is over customization at some point. And so we like the ability of fast starts, get value, configure, tailor as it's appropriate. But I think the key here is to get controls quickly and to get controls in a way that's leveraging best practices and industry trends for what good looks like.
Implicit in much of what you've talked about is benchmarking, that a company can create a set of data which it can internally benchmark a wide variety of risks. Does this solution allow also external benchmarking? so that either sources external to the company or your internal benchmarking can be compared against some trusted industry sources.
Definitely. So when you think about a risk management framework, you can look at yourself in isolation, but it's always best to look at yourself as a broader pool of similar type of organizations, but also from other data sets that would be objective in nature as well, right? So to your point, you can do an internal analysis, but without blending that analysis with other external analysis that leverage industry best technology, AI, regression models, machine learning, et cetera, you are missing that external lens. And so to be able to blend your internal analytics and the external benchmarks gives you my view, gives you a global view, and allows you to blend the two for a final view that gives you maybe an additional lens that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And so that complement is always something that we would recommend from a risk management framework perspective.
So I'm particularly interested in the process nature of really everything you've described today. I'm a lawyer by professional training. Many CCOs are lawyers by
Mhm.
professional trainings. Do they really understand the process nature of what you and Certa you have described and what Certa has as offerings, and see the inherent advantages of this process-oriented approach, allowing for data inputs that can then be benchmarked down the road?
I think so. I think they're starting to. As you can appreciate, just coming from the practice yourself, data collection is a laborious process at times. You need to fact check, you need to collect, you need to consolidate, you need to put the data to work. And so when you look at these organizations who are cost centers, obviously, everyone's looking to extract the most out of their value added resources, and you don't want value added resources doing what would be considered tactical or clerical activities. And so what we're seeing is a general shift towards we'll throw bodies at it to let's throw automation at it, but let's not have black box automation. You need to have the ability to understand what the decision tree is, if you will. If these conditions exist, do this. If these conditions exist, do that. But also the ability to tweak what happens when, where, and why, because we know regulations don't change. We know risk is only ever evolving. And so having the ability to adjust the dials, if you will, so that you trust the automation, so that you trust the process automation, and so that you've got transparency, so that you could always see this process started with person A, went to person C. Because person C didn't have the right details, it went back to person B, and so on and so forth, with business rules to automate along the way. I think everyone's starting to see the light that there is a better way, there is a more efficient way. And I think with the advent of AI, anyone who's not looking at more automated, more intelligent approaches is really going to suffer in the long run. So I think there's just a general shift towards, again, to use my prior analogy, trust but verify. Trust that it's happening, but verify that it is doing what you think it's doing. And having that visibility is paramount for me.
The Department of Justice has given the Chief Compliance Officer and the compliance function and corporation a continued series of ongoing obligations around their compliance program. Obviously, third-party risk management has been a long-standing demand from the DOJ for a best practices compliance program, but they've, over the past few years, talked about things like effective compliance training. How do you measure effectiveness? This year, in the 2023 update to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, they asked compliance officers to tell them the effectiveness of financial incentives paid to employees to do business ethically and in compliance. Can many of the strategies that you've used over the years and that you and Certa are using now as a process, could you help a compliance officer think of ways to gather data and then benchmark and analyze data from other types of data silos beyond simply third-party data?
Definitely. When you think about demonstrating the effectiveness of a program or controls or training, everything lies within the data, right? So, number one, when we look at the expected path that due diligence should take within an organization, we can look at deviation, number one, right? Did anything deviate from path? We can obviously, through business controls, prevent that deviation, but there's always exceptions that should be allowed. Unpacking what's driving those exceptions in terms of A, frequency, and B, the rationale for it. And so what we can do is start to extract that insights and report on it such that a compliance officer can understand where deviation's happening. Do we need additional process controls? Do we need to tweak who can do what, when, and where? So that would be number one. Cycle times are another, right? Everyone's trying to become more efficient. So if we can analyze the cycle time of the average individual within an organization, as an example, Dave is submitting T&E requests for government interacted dinners or T&E as an example, and I'm submitting them on a far more frequent basis. And the patterns in my submissions look strangely dissimilar to that of others. Those are red flags. When you think about training, as an example, everyone has to do compliance training, information security training, etc. Not just listening to the online courseware and clicking the button next, so you get through the training, but taking nuance-based questions. So I did the training, I got asked question one, but based on the way that I got asked question one, it's going to decide, do I get question two or question three? So it's going to be basically the challenge will be increased based on the level of my knowledge that I'm demonstrating to make sure that every individual within the organization is improving. Where there's clearly a lack of knowledge, to accelerate the additional courseware that an individual is doing. And again, trust but verify, report on what is happening within the organization to make sure that, again, you're addressing your weak spots and strengthening your strong spots.
Dave, let me change the focus just a little bit, because we've had the opportunity to go into the weeds on some tactical issues. I'd maybe like to ask you to look up a little bit and ask if you, your team, or Certa are having these types of conversations at the board level, and do board members understand, number one, the need for this type of orchestrated workflow and data analysis, but also that it's not simply a tactical tool, it can be a strategic tool that the board should oversee as well?
100%. We've had recent engagements where at the board level, it has been mandated that existing controls and existing traditional methodologies are no longer sufficient for organizations. And so they want to see workflow, they want to see automation, they want to see verification resources along the way. When you look at whether it's through the DOJ, the FCA, whoever the regulator is, when you look at the patterns of insufficient controls, it's because of a lack of standardized process controls that exist within an organization. There are corner cases that are just not under management, or they're just not tracked well enough. And so we've heard and been told that investment is being earmarked in this environment. It's not with every organization, but especially the larger public companies are really recognizing that, one, they only have a finite amount of resources, and two, those are good, intelligent resources that could be armed with better facts and data to be able to do their job. So we're definitely seeing that 100%.
Dave, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself, on Certa, or really any of the topics we've touched on, what would be the best place or places you would suggest they go?
Definitely. Thanks for having us, Tom. I can be reached on LinkedIn, obviously, at David Crozier. You can look up Certa and what we offer, and I hope that you do, at www.getcerta.com. And we can also be found on Twitter under the same handle as well. But appreciate the time, Tom.
Dave, this has been great, and I hope we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Data Driven Compliance, sponsored by Kona AI. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you will subscribe, rate, and review to the award-winning Data Driven Compliance. Data Driven Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.